Hi, baby Seth. Are you ready to acquire some language today? Gaga? That's right. People don't really understand how it works. So today we're going to talk about how we learn languages. Are you ready? Let's go. Hi everyone, welcome back. It's been a while, I'm sorry. It's been about 11 days or something. A few things I want to go over in this video. I want to specifically look at how children acquire language compared to adults. And I'm going to do this from three perspectives. We're going to look at biological, cognitive, and social differences. This video is not exhaustive. I think I've read a total of like 20 plus studies, and there's so much information, the video would not cover all of it. Some of the things I'm going to mention today, I think in the ebook I'm writing, I'm actually going to put a chapter in on this topic so I can go a little more in depth. And on that topic, I think too, I'm gonna, in this video, maybe I'll put it over here, but I'm gonna post the table of contents. It's called a mulu in Chinese, and that's what I was thinking of because my partner is helping me with the design and the layout of the book. So I'll have a designed kind of like prototype of the table of contents to show you the chapters and then what they might cover. One thing I'm curious though, and maybe you can drop this in the comments, is how you want the information presented to you. Like, do you want it to be really long? Do you want it to be kind of short key points? The way I was thinking of doing it was doing it in two ways. One is I'll have almost like I wrote a paper, so to say, but it'd be like a chapter for those of you that want to go more in depth. And then I think at the end of the chapter, I might have like key takeaways. At the beginning of the chapter, I might also have like key points for people to say like what this chapter is about, things it covers. That way, it kind of gives a little bit of everything to everyone, because I know some people might be really interested in reading a lot about theory or a lot about like research. Other people might not be. They might just want to know the key points. So let me know what you think about that. Also, in terms of like writing style, I will be using sources, but I kind of want to know what you think. I'll make a post on YouTube about this too, so you can comment in the post how you want me to source the information. A lot of times at least in academic writing for APA, we would put the source at the like for each thought that the source belongs to, but you normally would write the author's name and then the year. But sometimes many sources will have similar thoughts, and so then you put them all together and then it'll make a sentence. Well, maybe it's like a 10-word sentence, it becomes like 20 words because you have so many sources in there. So I thought I could either do that the way you would normally do it in APA, or I could do it where I put numbers for sources. So maybe number 1 is always this source and number 2 is always that source, and that way it'll make it kind of shorter. I'll give you an example in the post I make, and then you can kind of let me know what you think. With that out of the way, I want to get to our topic. I've been doing a lot of reading, and I think there's a lot of misconceptions going around about how we acquire languages, especially with Krashen's comprehensible input. I think Krashen himself, I don't know what his views are now on it. But originally when he made his hypothesis, he said that comprehensible input was sufficient for language acquisition, which meant that you only need that to acquire language and nothing else will make you acquire language. At least not directly. Like some things might indirectly help you, but his argument was that the direct cause of acquisition was comprehensible input. Now, there's debates on this, and the reason there's debates is because there's evidence suggesting otherwise. So normally when you have that, it means that it's likely that both sides of this coin is true to some degree, but maybe we're missing a piece that we haven't noticed yet, or we don't know how to examine it. Today we're going to talk about children's language acquisition, specifically like first language acquisition, comparing it to adult second language acquisition. The first thing I want to talk about is biological changes in the brain. One of the studies that I looked at, actually there were like 2 or 3 of them, but they discussed how children, basically how their brain processes language. And in one of the studies they did fMRI scans, so that's where they're essentially checking oxygenated blood flow in the brain to see where it goes, and then the suggestion from that is your brain is using that part. If you have oxygenated blood going to a certain part of the brain, that means the brain is you're using that area, or it's activated to do a task. Generally speaking, most typical adults, I say most because there are certain like exceptions, but most typical adults have language localized, not entirely, but like for the most part localized to the left hemisphere. Whereas children tend to have activation in both the right hemisphere and the left hemisphere, and then over time, as they get older, the activation in the right becomes less and less. And then in adults, generally there's little to no activation in the right hemisphere. You do have some like language comprehension in the right hemisphere, but generally speaking, it's all in the left. And again, I say generally because there are cases where maybe somebody had an injury, and so then their brain has to like essentially rework itself to use the right. And in one of the studies I looked at this too was about people who have brain damage. So this can happen to infants as well. Infants who have brain damage in the left hemisphere, they can recover much easier and usually fully, depending on when the injury happened and like to what extent. But they can recover their linguistic abilities fully, and it'll just switch to the right hemisphere. Adults can't do that, because the thing is once your brain has developed, and you're still developing, and you could argue that you're developing until you die, but most of your like faculties in your brain, they're essentially done with that long process of like total complete change or like drastic change to the brain. That doesn't mean you can't change things in the brain. Like when you're learning new things, of course you're making new connections and you're rewiring, so to say, but you're not going to have drastic changes that you see in childhood. Like the brain growth in childhood is so large. Like by the time you're 5, I think is what I read, your brain has already grown to 90% of its like full size. You know, so over the span of 5 years, you have that. And then the other 10% is over the course of a long time, and then until you reach adulthood, you know. I think it was like upwards into your 30s, like early 30s, they saw that there's still brain growth. There's obviously a significant difference between the way a child acquires a language and an adult from a biological perspective. I'm not going to get too much into this, but I'm sure you've heard about the critical period hypothesis. There's also now like a sensitive period hypothesis, because research kind of suggests there's something that exists, but it's not quite strict as people think. It's not like you go from like A to Z immediately. It's like a slow kind of a slow process of like essentially decline. It's not like you just all of a sudden go from 100 to 0. There is evidence that shows children do acquire certain things better and or faster than adults, one of them being phonology. Part of the reason people think this is because, one, their brain has more plasticity. Now, adults also have plasticity, but it's just a little more rigid than children. And during, I think around the age of 5, between the age of 5 and 11, I think, they have more cortical growth, like it's a period of extended growth, and language influences the growth and the thickening of the cortices. They actually have studies showing that thicker cortices correlates to like stronger language aptitude or language ability. It would suggest that there is a period of time, at least, where you learn better. Actually, it's funny because a lot of people think it's like really, really young babies, but generally the research has shown that young, like between the 5 and 11, 5 and 12, they learn better than like a 1-year-old would learn. The other thing too is like, if it's a really young child, their mouth is still forming, and so like it's easier for them to produce sounds, because as they learn these sounds and they try to produce them, their mouth will, the shape essentially is affected by it. Also, some studies have found that babies, like 6-month-old, 7-month-old babies, they can hear sounds in a foreign language better, and if they have enough input, those sounds will actually become a part of their linguistic system, so then they can differentiate them later. Whereas adults, when we get past a certain age, I think it's around 9 months, once you get past a certain age, your brain kind of like loses this ability. Maybe say like it loses this like natural inclination to hearing these sounds. And so in order for an adult to learn those sounds, they usually have to be taught explicitly. Now, it's not always the case, but there are studies that have shown like adults tend to pick up accents easier than children do. And there are studies that show children also have accents. It's not a guarantee that they won't. It's just that generally speaking, children have a much easier time of acquiring a more native sounding accent than adults do. One of the studies I read was about developmental differences in brain processing. So you have brain waves. One type is beta, one type is theta. This study looked at like semantic and syntactic differences between adult processing and child processing. But basically they found differences in the way that they process the information. So like young children were different than young adults, and young adults were different than adults. And it seems to show that there's like this developmental change over time, which would suggest there's growing, right? And this is why when I say to people like adults and children do learn differently, they acquire things differently. And people kind of just like to make that blanket argument. It's like, well, as long as they get input, we can learn just like a baby, but you can't. You just can't. Maybe similar, I suppose. But I think the implication when we say we learn like a baby, even though like means similar, I think the implication is just like a baby does. And you don't. You can't. It's physically impossible. Like from a biological perspective, it is physically impossible. The other topic I want to talk about is cognitive. And this focuses mainly on like memory. So a lot of people talk about like procedural and declarative memory, and they argue that children learn procedurally and adults are taught declaratively or explicitly, and so that's why we don't learn languages, because we're taught the wrong way. Like our brain doesn't work that way. Actually, that's not entirely the whole picture. Even children do use declarative memory for things, and there's research showing that children, when they learn vocabulary, actually are more likely to kind of use declarative networks to remember words as opposed to procedural ones. And there's also research showing that adults at lower levels of proficiency rely on declarative networks, but when they become more proficient and they have higher experience in the language, it actually moves from declarative memory networks to like procedural networks. And this is also why I think people kind of use this discussion of procedural and declarative without really understanding anything about it. It's more than just saying, you know, like, well, I learned it, you know, passively or implicitly, so that's better than explicit because explicit is bad. Actually, some of the studies show that adults who learn explicitly tend to outperform children, especially at earlier levels. And if you think about how long it takes a child to begin talking in a language, even understanding, like children might understand a decent amount or at least seemingly decent amount, but if you were to like really give a test of comprehension to a child, especially like a toddler, like a 2-year-old, their level of receptive vocabulary is not super high. And it's very related to their life. It's things that they're around or that they need or see. Whereas adults, in 2 years of study, can reach a pretty decent level of fluency. Depending on the language you're learning, you could easily in 2 years get to B1 or maybe even like B2. And if you really, really tried hard, you could probably get to like high B2 or even low C1. I mean, again, it depends on the language you're learning and how much you're learning or studying per day. But that's very doable. A baby does not do that. A baby can't do that. By age 2, they speak with like telegraphic speech, where it's like, they just say like 1 or 2 word sentences. They make a lot of like, I wouldn't necessarily call them mistakes, but like grammatical mistakes. They tend to simplify, you know, rules. This idea of like, well, children are better because they learn a certain way. Their brain, this is also linked to biology, but their brain is developed differently because it hasn't finished developing or hasn't, you know, really like gotten to the same developmental stage that adults are at. So then of course it's gonna process things differently. One of the studies I read showed that children actually, when they learn grammar, they use a mixture of declarative and procedural memory. It's not entirely procedural. They're more likely to rely on procedural when they're doing things. And this could be a number of reasons why. Like, one thing I think about too is like children don't really have a strong sense of self, or I should say awareness of self, right? Like they don't think about how they sound or how they look, or like, you know, they don't care about that kind of stuff where adults do. That means when adults try to produce language, they think about, am I saying this correctly? Is this the right sound? Did I use the right verb conjugation? Is this the right tense? Is the noun plural or singular? Like, we think about those things, children do not. And that might be one of the reasons also why they seem to rely more on this like procedural kind of thing, because there's our anxiety, in a way, you could say, like, holds us back. Like, you could make the argument, and I think Cognition does this as well, like, it kind of keeps you in this, like, explicit mode where you're constantly trying to monitor, which he talks about in his monitor hypothesis, but you're constantly trying to monitor your language. Children don't really do that. Maybe when they get older and they start taking classes, you know, going to school, they might start doing it. But generally speaking, especially native speakers, they don't really do that with their own language. The last thing I want to talk about is social differences. In a way, babies kind of have this, like, ever-present language learning partner with them, because they have usually a mother or a father, but it could be anyone really, like a nanny, a grandma, a grandpa, just somebody who, like, they have a caretaker with them. And the caretaker is not 24/7 giving them input. But the thing is when the child needs it, like when they need to communicate, someone is usually there helping in the process. But adults don't have that. The thing is too, is the caretaker has to be very, like, acutely aware of what the child needs. Whereas for an adult, other people around you are not, like, trying to figure out what you need all the time. You know, like, they don't think, oh, does he need to go to the bathroom, or did he eat? Or they don't think about that kind of stuff. That's one thing in the social respect that children have, is they have a lot more possibility for input. And the input is usually richer because there's a lot more of it. And studies have shown that parents, they have this thing called motherese, where, like, mothers tend to, it's actually adults in general, but mothers tend to change their tone, their speed, their pitch, their intonation, like all that stuff. Like, they change a lot about how they communicate with the child, even like types of words they use. There was one study where it showed that when parents speak to their children, they will elongate certain sounds. And in doing that, children actually can notice there's a difference, and then they pick up that sound faster than children who don't have elongation. Those are things that people do naturally. It's almost as if, like, being around a baby, you know, you want to talk, maybe not everyone does, but like a lot of people want to talk cute with the baby. They want to talk slow. They want, you know, like, they want to see the baby smile. This give and take, we don't really have that with adult learners. Like, if somebody came to you and talked to you like you were a baby, you would feel patronizing. You miss out on that. And for children, that's really beneficial. And if we learn just like a child, I would assume it'd also be beneficial for adults. I'm not saying we learn like children, because we don't. But that's kind of like, when people make that argument, they're not thinking about the social aspect of it. Also, babies don't learn passively. I mentioned this before in other videos, but babies do not learn passively. They are actively involved in the input. And studies I think I mentioned Patricia Kuhl a few times, but I'm going to post about her again in this video. Her lab has done many studies on how children acquire language through social interaction. They've done things where they compared like children watching videos compared to children listening to an audio, and then children interacting with a speaker. The children who interact with the speaker are the ones that learn. They're the ones that acquire the words or the sounds, or those kind of things. It's weird because when we talk about like learning like a child, especially like methods like that focus on this passive input, or even on like implicit input, not necessarily passive but implicit input, and they have this theory that we learn like children, then you need to interact. And if you say you shouldn't talk in the first parts of learning, then you don't think you learn like children. It's just a very weird, contradictory way to say you learn like a child, because children interact with their speakers, and the way children respond influences how those speakers will respond. So if a child smiles, if a child laughs, if it cries, if it coos, if it does certain things, like that influences the input they're getting. Especially when children get older and they can start gesturing. When a child can point, that most certainly influences the input they get. If they cry, make a crying sound, and the parent says, "What do you want?" and the child points, most parents are going to say, "Oh, do you want your cup? Do you want your cuppy, your sippy? Do you want this? Do you want that?" Guess what they're getting? They're getting input. Now they know, especially there's been studies on this too, like the eyes, basically gaze following can also help children learn new words. But in doing this, now when the parent says a word that the child might not know, they can actually hear the referent and see the item that's being referred to. It's kind of weird that people think that we just, I don't know, learn this way. Like, what adult does that? Nobody does that. And I think a lot of people would feel really awkward. I think part of the appeal of learning through passive input is that, implicit input, is that you don't have to interact with others and you can rely totally on yourself. And in a way, yes, you can, but guess what? Babies don't do that. Babies can't do that. They have studies too showing like children who don't have this social interaction growing up, they actually have language deficits as they get older. And while maybe not so noticeable if you study them under a microscope per se, like with actual like brain scans and testing, in adulthood those deficits can still exist, or they persist into adulthood. The language skills of an adult who's had like kind of like language neglect, so to say, will be usually typically lower than somebody who did not have such a neglect or such a lack of input growing up and a lack of interaction growing up. And that's the whole takeaway here. Like, interaction is so crucial in language learning that for anyone to say you just need to speak or you just need to listen, those are wrong. Like, you need to do both. You need to do both. They're both necessary. I can't necessarily say that you need to do more input than output, or you need to do more output than input. I think it depends on a number of things. It depends on the stage you're at. I think it depends on your personality and your temperament. Some babies are going to be more vocal than other babies. Some adults are going to be more vocal than other adults. Everyone has their own way of like wanting to interact with the world, and I think that's okay. I don't think we should push people to like, if you want to get fluent in a language, you need to do this one thing. And like, I don't think that's necessary. But I'm just saying, when you see videos of people saying things like, "Oh, we learn this way, we learn that way," they don't know. A lot of times they're people who are trying to sell you a course, or they're people who have no background in language education or language acquisition theory or anything like that, but then they want to use those theories to make the argument that they know what they're talking about. It's a lot of hogwash. A lot of doo-doo. There's a lot of stuff that I read, especially in terms of like, getting an accent or like reaching native like competence, which to me is really hard to define anyway, because if you look at fluency, like let's say I'm C2, okay? Like in English, let's say I'm C2. What does that mean? In most of the time anyway, like this proficiency level we use is not designed for native speakers. So if you are at a C2 level in English per se, like you're a non-native speaker of English and you're at C2 level, that might mean you have better command of certain fields of like vocabulary. Maybe you have better command of like certain conventional functions of writing. But generally speaking, native speakers have a much larger, wider vocabulary than non-native speakers. Usually, it's a lot larger. Part of that like proficiency has to do with education. So if a native speaker doesn't have the same level of education, you could argue you know things they don't know, but that's the same with anything else. If I have 30 years experience, as a business owner, but you have 15 years of experience and you have degrees in the background with it, and like you might know things I don't know. Yeah, that makes sense. One of the studies I read too has a very strong evidence that the systems we use for acquiring a language is what we use generally for other cognitive things. And if you think about people who are in cognitive decline, one of the things that usually goes first is like language. Not always, but generally speaking, they'll have like the way they talk. They might struggle. They might have like aphasia. And again, this depends. They found that like working memory, for example, is really important in language learning. Working memory, it's not like declarative memory, but it is like related to and kind of like interconnected with it. It's a different system, but like that's kind of one of the systems we use for problem solving, which is in a way like when you're learning grammar, you can view grammar in some ways as like a problem, and that's why adults seem to do better. At least one argument is they seem to do better. Well, not seemingly, they do. The studies have shown they do better in grammar. They say acquisition. Whether or not you want to call it acquisition, I don't know, because the term in research is used interchangeably with learning. Krashen used acquisition and learning, distinctively, but in research, generally speaking, learning and acquisition they're seen as the same thing. Or you could argue like acquisition means that they actually learned, they like fully learned what like the grammatical morpheme or something, and now they can apply it. That's like used as acquisition, but they might do it explicitly, which Krashen said is not acquisition. In the study that I looked at, they showed that like certain cognitive skills that we associate with like other forms of general learning are also used in language learning, and so then they're not trying to make an argument. They're just suggesting, does that mean that language is learned the way we learn other things? And if the memory systems are connected, like we also use working memory when we're learning math, or we use like declarative and procedural memory for other things. Like we use declarative memory when we're trying to learn how to ride a bike, and that shifts into procedural memory once you've learned how to do it, and it becomes like second nature. Language appears to do the same thing, and in the research they did like a meta-analyses of many different like brain studies, and it seems to suggest the same thing. That would also explain why there seems to be somewhat of a decline for how we learn language. Like as we get older, it seems to go down. The issue is, how fast does that go down? Is it a steep all of a sudden down from 100 to 0, or is that like over time? But we do know there is a decline. Like just like with aging, our bodies decline as we get older. Like we tend to have saggier skin, or our eyes tend to get worse, or our hair falls out, we have gray hair. Like obviously there's decline. Why would that not happen to language but it happens to everything else? That's what's kind of weird about the whole thing. People seem to think like the way you learn as a child is exactly the same as an adult, and your brain just is always at this like peak state. When does that ever go down? After death? There must be a time, where it's gonna like go lower, kind of thing. In my next video, actually, I want to talk about the critical period hypothesis a little more in depth and kind of look at fossilization, because I think this topic kind of connects to it, but the video would have been way too long if I would have done both. And I cut out a lot of stuff. Like you guys, I read. Let me look, I have my folder right here. Okay, 22 studies just in this folder, and then I think I have like 4 or 5 in another folder on fossilization. And I've read all of these relating to this topic. So that's too much information to put into a video. And so what I think I'll do is I'll try to separate it into a few videos, and then I'm probably going to use this to make a chapter in the ebook that I'm writing. We're slowly like moving along. I think my plan right now for the ebook is probably I would say probably like end of August, middle of September would be around the timeline when I'm able to release it. Partially because I'm kind of debating on what to do. Like when I look online, I mean, everyone does this stuff because they want to make money. I don't really care about that right now. I mean, maybe in the future, sure, but not right now. So I'm just going to give the book away for free. But a lot of people online will tell you, if you give away something for free, don't give too much. Like your ebook should be like less than 30 pages. I'm like, I don't know about you, but that 30 pages is not going to be enough. For me to be able to write what I need to write to explain stuff. I mean, I can simplify it, and I can like try to like break it down into like key parts, but if I'm gonna talk about all the topics I'm gonna talk about, there's no way 30 pages is enough. Like I'm picturing like maybe around 60 to 80 pages, and I think that that's not that long. I don't know. Tell me what you think in the comments. I want to be able to give you quality content that you can use to help yourself in learning the language, things that help you understand how it works. I'm also going to put a roadmap in there, so I think what I'll do is look at like how you should go in your path from like beginner to like advanced. And this might look somewhat different, between languages, but I'm just going to try to take the most general path I can, because obviously people are going to be learning different languages. You got Spanish, German, Chinese, French, Arabic, whatever, Italian, I don't know, Japanese. And let me know in the comments what you think what I should do about the page limit. Like, how long is too long? I guess that's what I need to ask. How long do you think is too long? Because if 60 pages is too long, I can cut things out. Just like in this video, I cut things out because there's too much to talk about. Like I read so many different studies on so many finite, tiny things. Like one of the studies I read, for example, they said that a mixture of movement and eye gaze, actually the two together like interact, and that helps children learn words. And one one of the arguments they made was because children's arms are smaller, so then when they hold an object, it takes up more of their visual field than like an object not in their visual field. So then it's easier for them to see, you know, what they're looking at. And then if somebody's talking about it now, they have a referent for like what they're seeing. And you know, but that's like a very fine, minute detail of just like how they learn words. That doesn't include like grammar or sound. And there was one study I read on like how children learning Spanish and English bilingually, how they acquire liquids, and you know, so there's a lot of things that I can't really get to in this video. Let me know in the comments, and I hopefully will do the fossilization video maybe next week. I have to do some reading still. That's part of the thing, is this like, I want to be able to give really good quality content that is like beneficial to your learning. For me personally, that means I need to have studies. I need to have things that I can use to help me kind of, because some things, like some of the stuff I learned is new, some is not new. Like some of the things I read, like, oh yeah, I knew that. But other things like learning about some of the brain scan stuff, because I don't focus on the neuroscience part. I'm interested in it, but it's not my focus. I don't generally read that kind of stuff. But I think having that knowledge available for you is really beneficial, especially because this stuff is not free. Like, I mean, I don't pay for, I mean, I do, I guess, but I don't. I use my school library to access it through my like doctorate program. But like, I guess in that way I pay for it. But otherwise, these studies are not free. They charge way too much. Like if you want to purchase a study, it's like $45, you know, so not worth. I want to be able to provide that access to you. Let me know what you think, what I said about the ebook and about my next video of fossilization, and I hope to see you next time. Bye.